Welcome to the Jacob's Ladder Podcast, where we talk about loving God, loving others, and loving ourselves at work and at home. Hello and welcome back to the Jacob's Ladder Podcast, episode 227. Today we're going to be talking with Jason Pierce, a man who I've done other interviews with in the past, and we're going to be talking about whether we're doing church correctly or not, and I'll just leave it at that. Let's go right to the interview. Hey, Jason, how are you doing today?
Doing very well, David. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, so we had an earlier discussion where we kind of did a recap of a talk that you had given to the youth at my church on having a vision for your life, and that was an excellent discussion. So the purpose of this discussion is to pick up on a little rabbit trail that we started to go into and decided needed to have a whole separate discussion. And basically what that rabbit trail is how this issue of a vision has been dealt with by the Christian church. And so, and the reason I think it's relevant for this podcast is because I think it gets to the issue of how do we love and engage with God, and living out our purpose individually as well as a corporate church body, I think is a big function of that, or a big portion of that. That's the way I view it anyway. So that's why I wanted to talk about it. Plus, you and I just had a great little side conversation about it. It made me want to kind of share that with others. So let me just start by, I guess, kind of throwing this out there, that it's been my experience after talking with you about the importance of a vision, that I have found information over time, quite a bit of information out there on this topic of a vision, but for the most part, not within the church. In other words, there was a period of time when I was fully engrossed with, the Tony Robbins, the Zig Ziglars, and other self-help people that are very inspiring, but to different degrees don't necessarily come forth there with a vision directly tied to the Christian theology. And it's from that, what I would call secular self-help world, where I've gotten a lot of information about the importance of a vision, how to have a vision, the impact of having a vision, a lot of good information. And yet, all these sermons that I've heard and all the different, Wednesday night discipleship teachings and retreats I've been to, basically the sanctification and discipleship process that I've experienced within the church has been dealt very little with this issue of having a vision for life. And so let me just start with, how has your experience been on that? Can you relate to what I'm saying?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's in a couple of ways. I think most, saliently is I'm a professor of business management, and just had the good fortune to teach some classes that taught me a lot. I hope they hopefully taught my students as much as well. But I've learned a great deal about when it comes to running organizations effectively. It really requires that we be clear about what our purpose is. And I've worked with colleagues. Even one of my clients, we've worked together about establishing a purpose statement for his company and saying, what's the purpose? What's our purpose in having this company, or even meeting? Everything starts in management with goals, is what I tell my students. And the purpose, so we also tell them, is more this overarching goal, right? The big goal that we're working towards. And then, of course, there's sub goals that get to that. And so professional athletes do this all the time. Let's do business people, right? We just had the Super Bowl, and football players start out. That's their big goal is to get the Super Bowl and win. And it starts with they got to win. They got to get into the NFL. They got to win a game, the first game, the second game, and then win the playoffs and so forth. So there's other goals involved, but there's always a really big goal that they're pursuing. And then I think I should also mention that purpose and vision go hand in hand, but they're really separate things. And my understanding of it, and if your listeners or you look online, you'll see different arguments and different conflicting definitions. Unfortunately, it's a very common issue with our language, and that's something I do research on. That's the conversation for a different time. But my understanding is that vision is the state of the world that we're trying to promote, especially with our organizations, not so much in athletics. But what kind of impact we want to have in the world, and the purpose is what we specifically do that contributes to that vision of a future reality.
So the vision, so the vision is the end goal, and the purpose is kind of how we get from here to there. Is
right.
that
well? The vision is more the end state, right?
Okay.
I was thinking about that. It's just incidentally happened to be thinking about how my mentor in grad school impacted me so greatly and taught me just the beauty of being overly generous, and how that's so freeing, and how it can just positively impact people. And I thought, what if we were all overly generous with other people? And how would that spread? And we know how hate and violence spread, but what if real just benevolence and love spread the same way? And I believe they do. And so working towards that vision of a world in which people are just, overly gracious to each other, as the norm is rather than the exception. But to do that, we still need a purpose of what are we going to do with our time? How are we going to act to bring about that future reality?
Okay, so I'm going to jump in and try to take the role of someone who might be listening to this, whether it's a pastor who's been delivering messages from the pulpit, or another Christian leader who might have a kind of a knee-jerk response and say, wait a minute. I mean, the message is the gospel, and the vision is to spread the gospel, and that should be enough for us as Christians to have a vision for life. How would you respond to that?
I would say, I'm completely unsurprised. I've heard that and I've observed that. And that is what we see. We focus on that, and I've been there as a Christian as well, primarily due to our understanding of what salvation is. And unfortunately, most Christians operate with understanding of salvation is that we need to preach the gospel so people get saved, so they end up spending eternity with God instead of an eternal damnation and suffering. Unfortunately, I've come to understand that's a misguided understanding of what the gospel is really about, and that salvation is really about this life, about how we can experience communion with God, life with God, by living in obedience to Him. And I'm not preaching salvation by works, just to be clear, but that we have access to have continual communion with God without having to commit animal sacrifices like they did in the Old Testament. We're not under that law anymore, as Paul taught. So what are we supposed to be doing? Yes, we can share the gospel, but that's not the end. That's the beginning. And unfortunately, what I see in the churches is that the sharing the gospel and getting people to accept Jesus is treated as the end, and so that's all that happens. Instead of what Paul taught, and I just learned this recently working with some high school students, looking at Romans 1, when he talks about wanting to have fruit among the Romans. And if we did a little word study, and when we look at Philippians 4, and I believe, and definitely Titus 3:14, it's very clear that we're supposed to be doing things to benefit other people, to meet their needs, their urgent needs, is what I think Titus 3 says, and that we're supposed to be creating, bringing about the kingdom and how we live with each other and the world.
So I wanted to just step back uh, a few minutes here to what you were saying about salvation is about this life. And I went and looked up this verse because that always comes to mind when I hear something along those lines, where in John 17, Christ says, "Now this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and
Right.
Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." What are your thoughts about that verse and how it relates to what you said?
I love that verse, and in fact, it's embedded in my email address. My personal email address is J31617.3. So many people know John 3:16, and they preach it, and for God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son, that so whosoever should believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. But most of us have operated without a clear understanding of what eternal life really means. And the verse that you quoted, John 17:3, defines it very, very clearly. But that's a relational knowing, right? Like knowing our spouses, knowing people that we're close to. Um, and we get to know God by living with Him, doing things with Him just like we do with other people. And the way we experience God in this world is by loving other people and obeying Him and trusting in Him to show us how to do that best.
So I'm just going to share a little bit more of my testimony and how I think about this topic, and that is that for the first uh, half of my life, I guess you want to say maybe half of my adult life, I kind of look back and view that as I went to church every Sunday. I believed in God. I believed that Jesus died on the cross. I believed that I would go to heaven if I believed that.
Mhm.
But for the most part, other than that hour or so on Sunday, I kind of switched over to a different mode the rest of my week. Not that I was, out there wickedly sinning every moment, but I wasn't really God focused, you might say, or I wasn't really focused on God's will for my life and trying to figure out how that affected all the decisions I made Monday through Saturday. Um, and I didn't have a passion along those lines. I had I had passion for goals. I mean, there were times when I was very passionate about pursuing certain goals, but they really weren't attached to the Bible. They weren't the result of me seeking God's will or desire for my life. And somehow I was okay with that. I'm not okay with that anymore, but I'm now I'm trying to figure out how to combine my faith with the rest of my life, or I have been on that journey for a while. And to me, that's where this disconnect is that and I don't think it's just me. I think there's a lot of people who segment their life, their church activities are one thing, and not that they're just wickedly living in sin outside of church, but they're not thinking about God necessarily and His will for their life during the rest of their life. I think that can apply to their work as well as the personal goals they pursue. I mean, can you relate to what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely, because that's how I've lived up until now, pretty much the same way. And even still, it's a challenge to say, okay, what do I do now with this new understanding, and to how do I integrate? That's probably not even the right way to say it. But how do I walk and live by faith in everything I do and bring in the eternal purpose with it, rather than what I typically have done is just live the regular, worldly life of trying to, you know, contribute, advance in my career, build up enough economic resources, financial resources, so I can retire comfortably and provide for my family and what everybody else does, right? And so that's a big challenge, and I'm right there with you, or at least with the listeners who are there. Maybe you figured it out already, and I can learn from you how to best do that.
So why do you think that there hasn't been more of a focus on this within the church? I mean, we can sit here and ask ourselves individually maybe why we're living our lives that way, But as why do you think the overall message of the church has lacked this application to everyday living?
Oh, I'd say it's something I mentioned before is that is the mindset or the belief that getting people saved, getting introducing them to Jesus is the end goal, is the end point, and rather than the starting point. And so if we live that way, you get the system that we have now, which is educating people the gospel so they can share the gospel or bring people to church or hear and that's why we have in churches, and at least churches I've gone to in the past, altar calls and things like that, so that people can get saved, which in my current understanding makes very little sense because church is for something completely different. And that is to have these conversations about how can we equip and edify each other to go out and bear fruit in the world by serving and bringing about the kingdom where we go.
Have you thought about, um, in kind of real practical terms, what the church might look like, and just in terms of how we do church, and I mean, any way you want to look at it. Have you thought much about that? Like, kind of had a
Oh,
vision for yourself of what the church might look like?
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, had this conversation with a new friend and colleague who I met through the same co-op. His wife is active there, and and their daughter goes there, but his name's Andrew Crawley. And Andrew has he has an even bigger vision than I have, but it starts with a very simple activity that instead of traditional church having gatherings that are limited to, I think maybe his gathering has about 5 families, but a number of that would be usually less than 50. I mean, definitely less than 50, and probably less than 30 people, or fewer than 30 people, I should say. And he and I talked about that. And this is where it gets back to these verses I was mentioning earlier about meeting urgent needs. And this was something that a seed that was sown in my head years ago by my friend Ed Wiley, who promoted the same idea that as the church, we're called to love people, and we love people by addressing needs. Right? We can't just like the book of James says, don't just say go be fed. You actually feed people if they're hungry. And so what I'm working towards, and Andrew's been nudging me very strongly to start my own gathering, which I hope to do so here soon, is bring people in our home. Some of them are former students of mine, friends, and couples that we know with their kids. And the starting point would be a check-in with each person and say, how are you doing really? And what needs do you have or do you know of that we can be considering for either action or at very least prayer, but hopefully some sort of action. And I've seen that play out all over the place. We go to the internet now for informational needs, right? I mean, I have this problem, that problem, so we can just look online. But there's tons of needs out there that are going unmet every day because we're not engaged with each other enough to know what's happening in each other's lives. And those are the lives of those around us.
So I have to say, I've had glimpses of what you're describing,
Okay.
in my experience. One of in different churches that my family's been involved in, there's been a big emphasis on home groups.
Right.
Where a handful of families get together once a week outside of church, and there
Mhm.
might be some discipleship aspect to it but for the most part, it's breaking bread and getting to know each other and trying to take off that churchy mask of everyone pretending that everything is just perfect. Um, and then over the last year, I've been going through a lot of personal struggles and have been in some discipleship groups, mainly a group of men, Christian men that meet online, and it's similar to that where you get together on a frequent basis once a week, and everyone is just checking in with each other. What are you struggling with this week? What what do you need? How have you where have you been in sin this week? What can we celebrate this week? Those are some of the questions we usually dig into. It sounds a little bit like a, whatever you want to call it, a therapy group or 12-step group. I mean,
Right.
there's different ways that people have tried to attack this. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't have anything to add. I was just agreeing. Yeah, that sounds exactly right. Uh, is that we need that connection and that accountability to each other. And I think that needs to be couched. And this is a really big one. You mentioned sin, is that this oversight, and that's something we talk about with the students, the high school students, and how we have we the Christians, or more often what I like to call churchians, focus on the really taboo sins, especially the sexual stuff and anything like that, and there's so much shame around those issues, um, and so people struggle alone and in silence or in anonymity with those things, and we overlook that the far worse sin is self-righteousness,
Amen.
and that one thing in addition to promoting the theme that we need to be aware of needs among us and our networks, we also need to constantly remind each other that, hey, when anybody confesses something, none of us are any better, and if we think we are, we're worse, and that's the real problem. So to eliminate that shame, so people can get freedom from those things, and I've certainly struggled with my fair share of sin, and I'm no better than anybody else, and really have even recently had to come face to face with my own self-righteousness and go, oh gosh, it just creeps up left, right, and center. It's all over the place. And we get so preoccupied with looking good like the Pharisees that we're not dealing with the real issues of the heart. And that's enough work right there. We don't need lots of, time and energy put into music and buildings and everything else. We need to work on our hearts. And if we did that, things would really open up for us as a community and as individuals.
Well, I mean, I've thought about how there is some guidance from the Bible on this. I mean, the early church as described in the book of Acts, and as well as just the way Jesus lived his life. A lot of times when we talk about the early church, seems like the first thing people go to is talking about gifts of the Spirit and how there was miracles and speaking in tongues and all that, and there's truth in that, but it doesn't seem like often we talk about the fact that they were meeting in houses,
Oh,
in
right, right. Yeah, they
in
didn't have
small
church buildings.
in small groups, and they were bringing everything they owned to get and sharing it with each other. Things like that, things that are just so foreign to the way we live now, and yet that is the way the people who followed Jesus were living, right?
Oh, yeah, they lived in real community with each other, and it's a bit tragic, but I feel I've had a greater sense of community in other situations than I've ever had in churches.
Oh,
And that's
yeah, I mean, my pickleball group that I get together with once a week and never talk about my faith generally with, is more, I feel like is more of a community than so much of what I've experienced in church.
right, because you're working together with those people to create something. In the case of pickleball, it's an experience. Just like I do CrossFit, and not very well, very mediocre at CrossFitter, but even still, that shared struggle with the exercises and the soreness and everything else creates the bond. And it's sad we really have, as a church, missed the boat on that, because if we said, okay, as a body, as a collective, we're going to work towards meeting specific needs, that would create, or even like, I said, the closest thing I've come to is Habitat for Humanity when I was in grad school. Because you're building houses together, you're doing something that creates a real bond. If all we do is just talk and sing, well, who cares, right? There's no significant impact with that. And I know people might react, well, people here didn't hear the gospel. Well, that's not what keeps them out of hell. So it's no good if we just get people to hear the gospel and just end there, um, because that creates a false sense of we got things figured out when we don't.
So two of the themes I've heard so far, one of them is being humble and real with each other, kind of authentic, vulnerable, you might say.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then another theme that I hear um, is doing something um, worthwhile. Whether it's challenging, enjoyable, helpful, and that can be just breaking bread together, or it could be doing a community. Like, I think that's one of the reasons I think both short-term and long-term missions can be a really good thing, because you are working towards a worthwhile goal together on something.
Well, but again, yeah, and often, yeah, when those missions involve meeting people's needs, then yes, absolutely. If it's just to uh, propagate churchianity, then it's I would say it might do that in a somewhat superficial way, but that's not nearly the same as when you do things that change people's lives, impact them, and free them from burdens.
Another thought I had was the fact that Christ, said that he didn't come to heal the I'm gonna paraphrase. He didn't come for those who were well. He came for the sick, and he reached out to what people considered sinners. He went to eat with the sinners and ticked off the Pharisees, and I know some of the parables he talked about, are where you invite um, those who are considered lowly in society, and so is that part of maybe what this vision should be too, that we're not just getting together with those that are just like us, but reaching out to those that maybe make us uncomfortable?
Well, I think yes, yes, and no. I would say both. Probably not yes or no, just both. Is that it's okay to get with people who like, and we should, as as a body of believers, we need time with just us, just like as a family, because we are a family, but just like our biological families, our family units do better when we get together and spend time together. And it's just us, it's just family time. And unfortunately, the church doesn't promote that. The church promotes this open format where anybody can come in because, again, they're convinced that their purpose is to make sure as many people hear the gospel and is accepted as possible, rather than saying, "Okay, we're glad you understand the gospel. Now, let's start doing life together. Let's talk about what's going on, and not pretend that you're okay just because everything's fine as long as you've heard the gospel." We know that's not true. I
So
mean, yeah, go ahead.
when you talk about, some of the things that just came to my mind are groups that we kind of shun as Christians seemed like they're doing life more the way you're describing it. I'm thinking of like the
And they
Mormons,
support each other.
the
Yeah.
Mormons, the Jehovah Witnesses, the Freemasons. I mean, these are like taboo things that we don't want to talk about because they have the wrong theology. But from
Well, I mean,
what
just
I go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was thinking even things that are that those are competing ideological views. But what about um, people in the gay community, the trans community, and things like that, or even the political groups, um, politicians and their different subgroups are very united together in their sense of camaraderie and solidarity. They support each other, um, and we don't do that. We say, okay, are you saved? Okay, good, check. We don't have to worry about you anymore. Except, are you making sure other people get saved? And that's where it ends. Instead of saying, no, as Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you.
Or
That was
or
his new.
or how about just sports? I mean, look at how sports and attending events and just talking about sports is such a passionate thing in a way, and then something that brings people together. I mean,
Yeah.
if we could have just a little bit of that in the
Well,
church.
sure, exactly. All that enthusiasm, energy. In fact, I've seen uh, it happened with people I know where they encountered a fan of the same team somewhere in another part of the country, and they buy each other beers and all this stuff at the bar, but over something that is ultimately inconsequential. And in the meantime, there's people with real serious needs, and we're not celebrating that, and we're not worrying about that. We're having Super Bowl parties at churches, and we're not having parties, birthday parties for kids that don't have families and things like that. And I'm not saying that to condemn it. It's like, yeah, we could do those other things. It's fine. But if we don't consider the needs of other people, then we're just, and I'm guilty of this as everybody else. Right. And I say this, to myself as much as anybody else, is, hey, we really need to start figuring out how to do that better.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much knew going into this we weren't going to figure this thing out. We were just we were going to talk about it and just talk about how important it is as an issue. Maybe is all we can accomplish. But another thing I wanted to say was there's some maybe positive things that we're not doing, but I think there's some also negative things that we are doing that are contributing to this, and that includes all the divisiveness within the church over things that we shouldn't be divisive over. Would you agree with that?
Well, sure. And a lot of those are theological issues, which are either inconsequential or derived from a misunderstanding of what salvation is really about. And that's tragic. It's not new. Paul wrote about similar issues, but unfortunately, it greatly diminishes our potential as a body of what we can do, the positive impact we can have on the world. Because if we were putting all that time and energy and resources into, for example, we know a family that fosters kids, and that's a huge challenge. And have gone to a fundraiser for an organization that supports and connects families with foster children. And that's a massive need. And wow, what if we solve that? What if we really set some of those kids free instead of, as I've done before, kind of condemns people that are out they're committing different crimes, or they're out just begging for money instead of working, instead of saying, well, what's that person's story? How did they end up there? Right? Because I don't think anybody that comes from a healthy situation and wants to be in those circumstances.
Well, and I used to think, well, as believers, we have a big overall vision of life that non-believers don't have. But I have to be honest, what I've found is that there are a lot of people that they may call themselves an atheist, or they may not call themselves an atheist, but that's pretty much where they're viewing life, who are very passionate about things like, whether it's, pick a topic, saving the environment. Those of us who are maybe consider ourselves more conservative like to, make fun of or criticize those who are more left thinking because they're so passionate about things that don't really matter. But is that the right way to think about it? Or should we be thinking, wow, first of all, maybe there is some value even from God's point of view in what they believe in, but also we should be trying to offer a vision that's at least as powerful as what they're excited about. Does that make sense?
Oh, I agree completely. And thinking in our conversations really opened my eyes last night. We should think, wow, we could learn something from them. Right? Where's our passion to have, even if misguided, right? Regardless of what the reality is with climate change. Yeah, at least they're concerned and trying to do something. And I'll say for example, with climate change, I think it's kind of this is an aside. It's a ironic issue that anybody would debate it, because it's really, everybody agrees that pollution's bad. Nobody thinks, oh yeah, sulfur and mercury and excess carbon dioxide and all this stuff is good. Nobody thinks that's good. Now, whether it's causing the Earth's temperature to change or not, I don't know. It might be, but I don't think it's really as a conversation. Yeah. So looking at those of different ideological orientations, especially the left, whereas many Christians are more right oriented. We could learn a lot from the members of the left who care about and the fact that they care about things and the state of the planet, people on the planet, the poor, the disadvantaged. We should be caring about those people as much and probably more, but we somehow we're more turned into our own um, groups. We're very insular, and we again are so fixated on just spreading the gospel that we lose sight of the fact that Jesus spread his message and won people over by meeting their needs. That's what got their attention. He fed them, he healed them, he set them free, and that's what won them to. Uh,
Well, I want to just respond. I want to just build on something you just said that we're so focused on sharing the gospel. I think we talk more about as a church about the fact that that sharing the gospel is important to us. I think we talk about that more than we actually do it. And
well,
I think if we actually had this vision that we're talking about and really felt like we were on fire for God and excited about what it meant for our lives, I think we would just naturally be sharing the gospel, or we would be so excited that people would be, wanting to know what our theology was. But I don't think most, and I'm not pointing fingers at others. I'm pointing them at myself just as much, that I'm not out sharing the gospel. And part of it, I think, is this lack of vision, this last lack of passion for this Christian life.
well, exactly. As we talk about the gospel, we want people to accept it, but we stop short of living it. And that's like what I've said about churches. I said we got to stop going to church and we need to start being the church. And those are very different things, and something I'm struggling to make that pivot in my own life. So I say that again, as somebody who's struggling with it, not with somebody, oh, I got it figured out, you got to do it like me. No, I'm not the right model for it. I want to do that, and I'm glad to have met people like Andrew Crawley, who has been pushing me to do it. And I think he'd be a great guy for you to have on the podcast, by the way. Um, and I'm thankful to have made those connections. And yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
and
there's
the other thing, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
So we get caught up in being busy. I remember the undergrad, he was a very young guy at the time to me. Now he's probably in his 30s, mid 30s. This guy named Josiah Newmaster. I was a PhD student. He was an undergrad at Indiana. And he liked to mention how C.S. Lewis wrote when he in the Screw Tape Letters that that Satan, one of the head demons, said about the Christians. They said, if you can't make them bad, make them busy. And that's definitely something I've been struggling with, being way too busy to be and distracted with things that are not of eternal consequence. I need to get that under control.
I totally agree with that. And I look back to an interview I did long ago with David Vanderpool. He basically was a successful surgeon who gave up his practice and just started a clinic. I think it was in Haiti.
Oh,
And
wow.
and he one of the things he said was part of most of what makes us so busy as Americans is entertainment. I mean, yes, we work hard. A lot of Americans are all about, working hard and proud of it. But, after work is done, I think that we fill our time with so much just entertainment, whether it's watching Netflix or doing whatever, that takes away, space and margin and time that could be used for something much more valuable and important.
Well, absolutely. And, some of us work a lot more hours than maybe we should be working too. Um, there is a case to be made for R&R. But yeah, how much? And I think that's a good point. And we tend to be a society of extremes.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way of putting it. And there was a podcast called the Emotionally Healthy Podcast, that, and I think one of their axioms is that God's will is often hidden in what is it? The areas of our hidden through in the extreme. In other words, we we're so oftentimes want to do everything to the utmost when maybe we shouldn't think that way. I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, but I think maybe as Americans more than anyone else, we want to do everything 110%, whether it's our work or our hobbies or our sports or whatever. And so maybe it's not a question of maybe that we shouldn't have entertainment or that we shouldn't work too much, but more of a balance where we're not trying to do everything so much to the extreme and just being a little more still and waiting on God. I don't know. I'm kind of all over the place on that right now, but that was just some thoughts I had.
No, I think you're on the, I would just say I would concur with what you said. I think that makes sense. I even think about my own, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again, where I spent a lot of time trying to build this earthly security and stability in my career, and have been neglectful about trusting God with those outcomes, and being and giving time and energy to the kingdom that I should be giving. I should be giving more than I'm giving.
Well, and it makes me think of something someone has shared with me recently about when you're listening for God's voice, it often comes in the form of self-sacrifice. Because we so often think about preserving ourselves, and so much of our activities go towards that. Like you said, building quote unquote security, but to actually exercise true trust, I think, kind of involves letting go of some of those things that are working towards our own security, and focusing on a different goal that has potentially no benefit to us.
Yeah, well, it brings to mind the verse where Jesus said that he who seeks to save his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will save it. And
Yeah. There's so many verses like that
oh yeah,
that we read, but I don't know. It's just I know. I just speak for myself. It's like, yeah, I'll read that and I'll say, oh, yeah, that's so true. But am I willing to really, really apply that to my life in real ways? When it comes down to the individual decisions.
Oh, sure. Well, and that's where it happens. That's where the rubber meets the road. So, well, it's refreshing to know that there's other people thinking these things, David, like you, and that we can challenge each other and encourage each other to make those adjustments that we need to make. So thank you for what you do and bringing up these questions.
Well, thank you. I mean, you brought it up in the first place, and I've really enjoyed our discussions. And like we said in the beginning, we're not figuring this all out on this conversation. It's just it's a journey, and we're talking about it. But I guess before we finish this conversation, is there anything else that we haven't talked about, particularly around this idea of a solution? What can we do to make a change in this area, both as ourselves individually as well as as a larger body? And do you have any other thoughts you want to share before we wrap this up?
Just a general one is that if we start engaging in activities with other believers, or we start looking for how our professional activities can contribute to the kingdom, I think we'll end up in a place where we're really engaged and energized in life. And I'm part way there with my career, because what I do is teach people how to, and myself in the process, incidentally, how to manage ourselves and our relationship with others and make better decisions. And that activity opens up a lot of powerful questions, because it's all about our lives. So there's many of the people that we plan to invite to our gatherings are, again, former students. So, and then on the flip side, if our communities, our Christian communities, are engaged in activities, whether it be working with foster kids or building homes with habitat or what have you, or opening medical clinics, that too should open up opportunities to see for believers to see where there's professional activities they could pivot to, or how their professional activities, where maybe they didn't realize it before, really can contribute to those kingdom building efforts. And I hope that is something that happens to other listeners out there, and for us as well. And again, I'm glad that God's put me in, brought a lot of interesting people into my life last year that keep bringing these issues up, these conversations up, so that I keep thinking about them and making the adjustments I need to make with my family.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation, Jason. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. If anyone wanted to reach out to you, learn more about what you do, or contact you, how would, if you don't mind, how would they go about doing that?
They can reach me. My personal email address, as mentioned before, is letter J 316, like John 316, 17:3, like John. So John 316 and 17:3 at hotmail.com. If it's related to the profession of management or would somehow intersect with my role as a management professor, they can reach me at my UNCG email account, which is the letter J R PIERC, the number 2 at uncg.edu.
Very good. And I'll include that in the show notes. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening. We'll talk to you again sometime, Jason.
All right. Thank you, David.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Jason Pierce as much as I did. And I hope you are feeling inspired to apply something you heard to better love God, love others, and or love yourself. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to our next time together.